What if life is not just chemistry bubbling in a warm pond, but a message, written, stored, and read long before any of us arrived? In 1953, inside a cramped Cambridge office, James Watson and Francis Crick sketched a ladder that twists to the horizon, the DNA double helix. It was more than a pretty molecule. It looked suspiciously like architecture. It felt like code. A century earlier, a quiet monk named Gregor Mendel had already guessed that heredity travels in packets, genes, though he did not know the shape of the courier. Between Mendel's peas and Watson Crick's helix, a stubborn idea ruled biology. Explain life by physics and chemistry alone, and you will explain everything. Then DNA arrived, and with the arrogance of a headline announced, "I am not just matter. I am information." Information is bossy. It has rules, order, and purpose. It tells a cell when to divide, a tissue when to form, and a body how to become itself. That is why Francis Crick later admitted, plainly, almost wearily, that the origin of life can appear almost a miracle, given how many conditions must be satisfied at once. Not because science stops at the word miracle, but because DNA behaves like something more than a crystal growing in a dish. It behaves like a script. This film is not a sermon and not a lab notebook. It is a guided tour of the moment. Humanity opened the book of life and found language inside, an alphabet of 4 letters, arranged with grammar, spelling, and intent. Along the way, we will meet Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, the old champion of pure mechanism, Norbert Wiener, who taught the world what information really is, and modern geneticists who build and break code for a living. We will ask a blunt question Europe's universities have wrestled with since the Enlightenment. If life runs on information, where does information come from? Strap in. Whether you lean materialist or metaphysical, the next chapters will force us to read DNA not as glittering matter, but as a message. And messages, as every civilization learns, always have a sender and a meaning. The historical puzzle. Before DNA. In the 19th century, the quiet gardens of a monastery in Brno, Moravia, held an unexpected laboratory. Gregor Mendel, the monk who would later be called the father of genetics, meticulously crossbred pea plants and tracked their traits, wrinkled versus smooth, yellow versus green. He noticed that these traits did not blend endlessly as the textbooks of his time suggested. Instead, they reappeared in fixed ratios, as if tiny, indivisible packets of inheritance were shuffling through the generations. Mendel called them factors. Today, we call them genes. But in his era, Mendel's work was largely ignored. Most naturalists were under the sway of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's conviction that life could be explained purely by matter and mechanism. The reigning model was mechanical materialism. Life was just an elaborate chemistry set, a dynamic but soulless machine. According to this doctrine, if scientists could only master the laws of physics and chemistry, they would eventually unlock every secret of biology. Yet there were cracks in the model. Even before DNA was known, Mendel's factors suggested something elusive, almost immaterial, an abstract code guiding material outcomes. His P's whispered of rules and instructions, not just molecules bumping in the dark. This tension deepened as the 20th century began. Researchers scoured cells in search of Mendel's mysterious carriers of heredity. Was it proteins? Lipids? Some yet unknown chemical crystal? For decades, biology was split between those who believed heredity was simply the product of complex chemistry and those who suspected a hidden layer of information was at work. By the time Francis Crick was trained, this intellectual battlefield was still smoking. He had absorbed naturalism, yet he was too sharp to ignore the evidence piling up. When he finally encountered DNA, his astonishment was not that it was a molecule, of course it was, but that it behaved like a messenger. For a naturalist of the early 20th century, this was nothing less than a revolution. The puzzle before DNA, then, was not only what carries heredity, but is life mere matter, or is it matter carrying a message? DNA would answer both questions in one stroke, and in doing so, redraw the map of biology forever. The revolution of the double helix. It was a spring day in Cambridge, 1953, when 2 young men hurried into the Eagle pub to announce to anyone who would listen, "We have found The Secret of Life. Their names were James Watson and Francis Crick, and what they had pieced together on scraps of paper and cardboard models would soon alter every textbook in biology. The revelation was the double helix, two spiraling strands coiled around each other, like a twisted ladder reaching toward infinity. Each rung of this ladder was a pair of chemical bases, adenine with thymine, cytosine with guanine. 4 letters, paired with strict rules, repeated billions of times. At first glance, it looked elegant but simple. On reflection, it was a bombshell. Why? Because this structure explained not only how life is built, but how it remembers. The sequence of letters, A, T, C, G, was not random decoration, it was an alphabet, and the alphabet came with grammar. Each triplet of bases, a codon, spelled out an instruction for an amino acid, which in turn assembled into proteins, the workers, builders, and engines of every living cell. Suddenly, heredity was not just chemistry, but language. In a stroke, the double helix transformed biology into an information science. The discovery forced scientists to see life in an entirely new light, not as a tangle of molecules bumping into each other, but as a system organized by code, stored in every nucleus, replicated with precision, and read with purpose. This was the revolution of 1953. The old dream that physics and chemistry alone could explain life had been upended. Now biologists realized they were staring at something different, a text, written in a 4-letter alphabet, copied faithfully across generations. The machinery of heredity was no longer a mystery, it was a script, and humanity had finally glimpsed the opening pages of the Book of Life. Watson and Crick had not merely discovered a molecule, they had opened a door. On the other side lay a new world, where the question of life was no longer what are we made of, but who or what wrote the code we carry in every cell. DNA as the ultimate information system. Once the initial shock of the double helix settled, scientists began to notice something even more astonishing. DNA behaved less like matter and more like software. A snowflake can form exquisite patterns, and salt crystals can grow with flawless order, but those are repetitions of physics, symmetries born of geometry. DNA is different. It does not merely repeat, it communicates. Every strand of DNA carries a code with syntax, symbols, and instructions. Its 4 letters, A, T, C, and G, form words called codons. Each codon corresponds to an amino acid, the building blocks of proteins. Proteins then fold into precise shapes that construct tissues, catalyze reactions, and keep the engine of life running. It is not chemistry alone that decides which protein will form, but the sequence of letters, the order, the grammar, the logic. This is information in its purest form. The resemblance to human technology is uncanny. Computer scientists talk about binary code, strings of ones and zeros directing machines. DNA is more sophisticated. Its 4-letter alphabet can produce far more complex instructions than any binary string. One strand of DNA in a single cell contains enough information to fill dozens of encyclopedias, all packed into a spiral smaller than a grain of dust. Francis Collins, who later led the Human Genome Project, once called DNA the language of God. He was not speaking poetically alone. The more researchers studied the genome, the more it seemed like a script deliberately written rather than a jumble of letters. The grammar was tight, the spelling consistent, the meaning unambiguous. Unlike crystals or snowflakes, DNA is not the result of atoms lining up under environmental pressure. It is a coded message, capable of being read, copied, and even edited. It instructs a cell how to divide, a liver how to filter, a brain how to think. The comparison is less to a snowflake than to a library, or to the operating system of life itself. By the mid-20th century, biology was no longer just the study of living matter. It had become the study of information systems, how they are written, stored, transmitted, and corrupted. And at the center of it all stood DNA, the most efficient, most elegant, and most mysterious code the universe has ever displayed. The miracle was not just that life exists. The miracle was that life runs on instructions, as if some great programmer had left a message written in every living cell. The limits of natural explanations. For most of the 19th and early 20th century, scientists carried a deep confidence. One day, physics and chemistry would unravel every secret of life. If a cell seemed mysterious, it was only because microscopes were weak or chemical methods crude. The consensus was simple: give science enough time and matter will explain itself. But DNA complicated the story. Suddenly, life was not just chemistry, but information, and information has peculiar properties. It requires order, purpose, and meaning, qualities that raw matter does not generate on its own. A crystal of salt may be beautiful, but it cannot compose a sentence. A snowflake may be intricate, but it cannot instruct a cell to grow eyes, lungs, or memory. This unease echoed a discovery from an entirely different field: mathematics. In 1931, Kurt Gödel published his incompleteness theorems, proving that every logical system contains truths it cannot explain from within. No matter how powerful, the system cannot account for its own foundations. It must appeal to something outside itself. Biology, confronted with DNA, faced a similar dilemma. If life is governed by a code, can that code be explained by chemistry alone? Or does it point beyond chemistry to a source that supplied the very information matter is now carrying? Francis Crick himself, though a convinced naturalist, admitted that the chance formation of life through blind processes was almost impossible mathematically. Too many conditions had to align, too many sequences had to match, too much precision had to occur all at once. To describe the origin of life as an accident was like describing the Library of Congress as the result of an ink spill. Yet, many scientists clung to naturalism, not out of evidence, but out of conviction. The doctrine of materialism had been their North Star for centuries, and abandoning it felt like treason. Still, the cracks widened. The more researchers decoded the genome, the more they saw patterns of design, not chaos. Here was the limit of natural explanations. Chemistry could describe the letters, physics could describe the bonds, but neither could explain the message. Just as ink and paper cannot explain Shakespeare, molecules alone could not explain the living script of DNA. By mid-century, the scientific community was standing at a crossroads. Either cling to the belief that time and chance could write libraries, or entertain the unsettling possibility that intelligence, somewhere, somehow, stood behind the code of life. Two possible paths. By the late 20th century, the DNA code forced science into a corner. There were only two serious options for explaining the origin of life's information. Option 1. Information arises from chemistry itself. According to this view, given enough time and the right environment, molecules will self-assemble into instructions, just as lightning can spark a chemical reaction. Entire research programs tried to simulate this: primordial soup experiments, high-energy simulations, elaborate computer models. Yet decade after decade, the results were disappointing. Complex molecules formed, yes, but never the kind of structured, rule-based code required for life. The leap from matter to message remained unbridged. To call DNA a product of accident was like claiming a Shakespearean sonnet was typed by a cat walking across a keyboard. Option 2. Information requires intelligence. Codes, by definition, come from minds. Human languages, computer programs, musical scores, all are examples of information that originates in thought. If DNA is truly a code with alphabet, syntax, and semantics, then perhaps it too points to a coder. This was the conclusion that shook the world of philosophy when Anthony Flew, once the most famous atheist in Europe, publicly admitted late in life that a mind must have written life's script. He did not convert overnight to traditional religion, but he acknowledged the obvious: codes do not write themselves. The choice was stark. Either cling to the first path, believing against mounting evidence that matter alone produces meaning, or take the second path and accept that DNA might be evidence of design. Neither option was comfortable. The first felt increasingly implausible. The second opened doors many scientists preferred to keep shut, for it suggested that the universe was not indifferent, but intentional. Francis Collins, leader of the Human Genome Project, leaned toward the latter when he described DNA as the language of God. Others resisted fiercely, arguing that invoking design was a retreat from science. But whatever one's worldview, the reality remained. DNA looked and behaved like information. And information, in every example humanity has ever known, comes from intelligence. Two paths, one question. Is DNA the accidental poetry of chemistry or the deliberate script of a cosmic author? The answer would define not only biology, but our very understanding of existence. Voices from science. As the shockwaves of the DNA discovery spread, an array of scientists from different disciplines began weighing in. Many spoke with awe, some with skepticism, and others with reluctant honesty. Together, their voices painted a picture of a molecule that refused to fit neatly into the old materialist frame. Take John Sanford, a respected geneticist at Cornell University. After decades studying mutations, Sanford concluded that genetic changes did not lead to progress, as Darwinian theory had hoped, but to decay. In his book, Genetic Entropy, he argued that mutations slowly erode the genome, like rust eating away at steel. Evolution, he said, was not climbing upward, but sliding downward. DNA, rather than showcasing endless creativity from chaos, revealed a system designed with such precision that even minor errors pushed it toward collapse. Then there was David Baltimore, Nobel Prize-winning biologist and one of the founders of modern virology. He admitted bluntly that biology is ultimately an information science. For him, the marvel of life lay not in the chemicals alone, but in the coded instructions those chemicals carried. To understand life, one had to think like a programmer, not just a chemist. The father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, made the same point in different words. Information is information, not matter or energy. With that line, he severed information from the physical world that scientists had long believed could explain everything. If information is its own category, then DNA was not merely matter behaving strangely, it was something deeper, matter carrying a message. Even computer pioneers noticed the parallel. Bill Gates, marveling at the genome, once remarked, "DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created." Coming from a man whose fortune was built on code, this was not metaphor. It was recognition. Life's operating system made human technology look like child's play. These voices did not all agree on what DNA's complexity meant, design, chance, or something else. But they agreed on one point. DNA was not just another molecule. It was a library, a language, a program. And in every human experience, libraries, languages, and programs trace back to minds. The chorus from science, then, was clear. Whether through the warnings of Sanford, the confessions of Baltimore, the logic of Wiener, or the astonishment of Gates, DNA was being recognized for what it truly resembled. Not a chemical accident, but the most advanced information system ever observed. The miracle argument. When Francis Crick, the very man who co-discovered the double helix, reflected on the origin of life, he did not sugarcoat his conclusion. To form life by chance alone, he admitted, would be almost a miracle. This was not the language of a preacher, but of a scientist staring at probabilities so vanishingly small that the word impossible seemed more accurate than unlikely. Why such a dramatic admission? Because DNA requires a staggering set of conditions to work. The code must be precise, the letters must line up in exact sequences, and the proteins they produce must fold into shapes that function perfectly. If even a single step goes wrong, the system collapses. For life to begin, millions of coordinated events had to converge at once. The odds of this happening randomly are smaller than writing an encyclopedia by spilling ink across paper. Crick's choice of the word miracle matters. A miracle, by definition, is not simply the improbable. It is the impossible becoming real through causes beyond nature. For Crick, the sheer improbability of DNA's origin ruled out the idea of spontaneous assembly from dead matter. Chemistry alone could not write code. Something else had to be at play. Other scientists echoed this reasoning. They pointed out that, unlike snowflakes or salt crystals that repeat patterns automatically, DNA encodes instructions. Each sequence is not a random design, but a deliberate command. Build this protein, stop here, start again. Instructions imply intention, and intention is the fingerprint of intelligence. Thus emerged what many call the miracle argument, that DNA, with its encyclopedic complexity and razor-sharp precision, is evidence of design far beyond chance. Not all scientists were willing to follow that line to its theological conclusion, but few could deny the weight of the data. Even those committed to strict naturalism often admitted, quietly, that DNA looked like a system too elegant to be an accident. In this light, the existence of life is not just remarkable. It is a standing challenge to materialism. For if DNA is a miracle, then perhaps life itself is not the product of chaos, but the echo of an author. A miracle does not erase science. It demands that science expand its imagination. Philosophical and spiritual implications. The discovery of DNA did more than revolutionize biology. It cracked open a centuries-old debate that Europe, perhaps more than any other continent, has wrestled with since the Enlightenment. Are we merely clever arrangements of atoms, or are we written beings, carrying within us a message that points beyond matter? For materialists, the answer seemed straightforward. Life is chemistry, nothing more. Admitting design felt like surrendering the hard-won independence of science. To invoke intelligence, they argued, was to retreat into superstition. The French naturalist tradition, stretching back to Lamarck, had insisted that matter alone could explain all phenomena. In many universities, this conviction hardened into dogma. Biology must not permit a designer to step across the threshold. Yet DNA unsettled this confidence. Francis Collins, no stranger to the laboratory, famously described the genome as the language of God. He did not mean that every base pair spelled out scripture, but rather that the very existence of a coded alphabet in our cells was compatible with, even suggestive of, a higher mind. On the other side of the spectrum, the philosopher Anthony Flew, once Europe's most celebrated atheist, shocked his colleagues by conceding late in life that a mind was the best explanation for DNA. For him, decades of arguments dissolved in the face of a code that looked unmistakably authored. These shifts reveal the philosophical fault line. DNA forces us to treat information as something irreducible to matter. And once you admit that, you're already standing on metaphysical ground. Information comes from intention. Codes come from coders. Whether you call that coder God, a cosmic intelligence, or some yet unnamed principle, you have stepped beyond chemistry into the realm of meaning. For a European audience, heirs to both Christian theology and secular rationalism, the implications are sharp. On one hand, the genome affirms the Enlightenment dream of knowledge. We can read the script of life. On the other, it whispers something older, that life may be given, not merely assembled. DNA speaks in both tongues, scientific and spiritual, inviting each listener to decide which accent they hear more clearly. Thus, the debate is not merely about molecules. It is about worldview. To see DNA as accident is to embrace life as blind fortune. To see DNA as message is to believe life carries intention. Either way, the helix that coils in every cell of our bodies is not silent. It is a philosophical summons, asking us what kind of universe we think we inhabit. DNA is the eternal code. The journey that began in a monastery garden with Mendel's peas and climaxed in a cramped Cambridge office with Watson and Crick's cardboard models has carried us to a radical realization. Life is not only matter, it is message. DNA is not just a molecule twisting in elegant spirals. It is a code, an alphabet of 4 letters that writes every living story on Earth. Over the past century, we have learned that DNA carries the architecture for eyes, wings, and memory, for forests, oceans, and humankind itself. It is a library packed into a thread of chemistry, so compact that a single cell holds volumes greater than any human archive. Unlike crystals that repeat or snowflakes that decorate, DNA instructs. It tells the cell when to divide, the heart when to beat, the brain when to remember. It does not merely exist. It commands. This, perhaps, is the most humbling discovery of modern science, that life runs on a script. And with scripts come questions. Who writes them? Why they were written? And what story they are telling. Francis Crick admitted the odds of life forming by chance were almost impossible. Francis Collins called DNA the language of God. Philosophers like Anthony Flew abandoned lifelong skepticism when faced with the undeniable reality of code. Even computer pioneers such as Bill Gates could not help but recognize DNA as software infinitely beyond anything humans have designed. For Europe and the wider world, this recognition carries both scientific and spiritual weight. If DNA is merely an accident, then our lives are the echo of randomness. But if DNA is a message, then every heartbeat, every thought, every generation is part of an authored story. The double helix is not just biology, it is philosophy written in flesh. So we close where we began, with a question. If DNA is a language, who is the author? The answer may divide laboratories, churches, and coffeehouse debates. But one truth remains. DNA is an eternal code, a miracle in plain sight, spiraling in every cell as the most profound reminder that life is not silent, it is written. And written things always mean something.